All right. Continuing with our current week's theme of identity politics, and we discussed about Nigeria's case. Now we shift our focus to the Swedish case. This video, we are going to look a little bit at the article on immigration policy in Sweden, which is called "From Immigration to Integration Policy." And again, this can tell us something about Sweden in one of our country case, but in a sense, Sweden is also supposed to serve a little bit as an example for us and of the immigration experience in general of European countries to help us understand that, again, for most European countries, immigration has been something that's been related more to emigration, right? That Europeans have left Europe to go to New World or maybe to colonize Asia or Southeast Asia to a smaller degree. But the point is simply that Europe's history with migration has been fairly recent. Europe as a destination for migration has really only been the case since World War II, and really not right after World War, but much later, beginning a little bit in the 1950s. That's really um, something worth beginning in the 1960s and 70s, and certainly right now, European society maybe find themselves to be challenged by immigration to a far larger degree than the classic settlers countries like United States or Australia or Canada, which are largely, or some of the Latin America, which are largely made up of immigrants. After an initial period of colonization, and also particularly in the United States and Australia, after basically killing off a lot of native population. So Europe's history is a little bit different. When I think I want to introduce you to before we get into Sweden. What really brought a lot of immigration into many Western European countries was what we call guest worker programs. And there was this idea that in the late 1950s, particularly in Germany, but in some other countries as well, the economies of those countries were recovering, but there was a lack of sufficient amount of workers. Really, what's happening was that as they started to industrialize, I mean, also reindustrialize in the case of Germany, the workers left the countryside, went into the factories to work, and there was nobody left to do the agriculture. So this led to a system where they started to recruit a lot of workers to work in most difficult areas, low paying agriculture jobs, or difficult dirty jobs such as mining. And these were known as guest worker programs because, of course, the idea was that this would be a short term process. There wasn't a major long term plan for people to stay here, and they invited them to come as workers and then leave, and then to leave as workers. Mm, uh, Not to bring their families and not to settle permanently. Very difficult uh, than what happens obviously in the very different from what happens in the obviously in the US. Before that, in this period of time, beginning in Germany in the 1950s, but with most other countries in 1960s as well, continued until the economies of the world went sour with the oil crisis in 1970s. And that basically led most of this country to stop recruiting. So what really happened here is then afterwards though was that the amount of foreign workers who came really dropped. But immigration made pretty high because a lot of these workers had ended up bringing a lot of their families to stay with them, over this period of time, because they didn't come for 1 or 2 years to stay. They stayed much longer period of time and started to integrating, or at least find their way into those societies. Migration has really resumed again. It wasn't encouraged in the 1970s or the 1980s, but in the 1990s we saw a lot of migration continuing then, or resuming. But now from the Eastern Europe, right? Not just from within the Europe. Many times the guest worker programs brought Southern Europeans to Northern Europe, or maybe workers from Turkey and North Africa, such as Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, to various European countries. But the latest migration has really been immigration, which is coming from Eastern Europe. After the fall of Soviet Union, a lot of refugees coming, but also people looking for economic opportunity. And these has now pretty much not given away. Not that that has ended, but has added migration stream, uh, has been part of forced migration. And again, I have to go with the word forced there in parentheses, because some people argue this is not so much forced migration. Sometimes this is an economic migration. People are fleeing, the lack of jobs, extremely low paying jobs, no economic prospect, no future in these countries, as opposed to those who might be coming because their house has very much been destroyed or something of that nature. So a difference may be between someone from Syria and maybe somebody coming from many of the sub-Saharan African countries. Okay. Now, Sweden is again emblematic of migration to Western Europe. So, this is a pattern I have just laid out there for you. Is true not just for Sweden, but really Germany, Austria, Netherlands would be exactly the same case. France is a little bit different because France has also colonial ties, and the UK also has colonial ties. So a lot of migration tends to happen from countries that were initially colonized by France or the UK. When you have never, so this is true for these countries, but less so true for France or for southern European countries like Italy or Spain. So let's look at this piece that tells about the Swedish migration history, right? Again, this was traditionally one of the homogeneous and at least least foreigner filled countries in the world. This has been the traditionally what Sweden's society was. Again, pretty far north, a language not easy to master, although that shouldn't be much of a problem because Swedes, of course, speak excellent English. So, as long as you speak English, you are pretty much set in Sweden. But, anyways, that was a setup that had existed in Sweden traditionally. Nevertheless, in the 1960s, Sweden started to enter the guest worker system itself, and during that time, it was a period which seemed to work pretty beneficial for Sweden itself as a country. About 30,000 to 60,000 migrants were coming in a year, which is quite a bit. A few of them were refugees. They were mostly people were coming to work. As a result, in the 1970s, annually they made 6 billion Swedish krona, contributing to the economy. So, an economic bonus, we would say. And again, because a lot of these workers who came for short term basis, they did not bring their families, so they weren't accessing very many social services. Instead, they were simply working, increasing productivity, and not sapping unemployment coffers very much either. This, of course, changed in the 1990s when the migration profile shifted drastically for Sweden, so that we see a lot more refugees coming from Eastern Europe, but also from other places, Southeast Asia and Africa. And suddenly that changes also this aspect of cost and benefits from an economic perspective. So that suddenly per year, the cost of keeping up these refugees puts Sweden in negative. That it costs about 20 billion Swedish krona. I mean, kind of related to this is, of course, this idea that Sweden, of course, has a very generous welfare state, as we have already seen, and thus the issue of unemployment rates are very important. Employment rates just means what percentage of your working age population, and again, working age population, which simply I think means 18 to 65 or whatever the retirement age in that country, right? So, what percentage of the people within the age of 18 to 65 actually have job and actually work there? With the idea being, if you have a high employment rate, then you are not going to have that many people who are relying on welfare. Okay, so just to look at this, in Sweden, the profile is such that while 78% of the native groups of Sweden, native-born Swedes work, uh, with as against with the foreigners is only 62%, a lot fewer than find job. So a lot more percentage wise, a lot more of them being probably going to rely on welfare. Again, it's not simply always just being unemployed. Sometimes it might be that your average Swedish woman is much more prepared to be in the workforce, and that many of the countries where people come from or where Swedish migrants come from are countries where women are not encouraged, don't have a tradition of entering into workforce. So a lot of them stay at home but don't go to work. Whatever the case is, you can see this can create some tension here and how Swedes interpret foreigners coming there. And just that, uh, by the way of comparison, let's look at in the United States and see if it's similar. It's not very much so because, in fact, in the US, a higher percentage of foreigners are actually in the workforce than the natives. And of course, one of the reasons that might explain this is that we don't have the same generous welfare state. So if a foreigner comes here, they might want to be prepared to work because they are not going to get as many benefits as it may they were in Sweden. So that's the history piece that lays out for us what the peace documents is this shift in Swedish policy from one that very much focused on immigration and how people come um, into the country and what the conditions would be the for coming into the country to one they would be focusing on integration on the people who are already there, how well they fit into society. And by the late 1990s, they have realized that while immigrants certainly weren't starving or anything like that, they tended not to be very highly employed, right? And they tended to live in communities by themselves. So rather than being well integrated and mixed and found in all parts of society, so they were usually found in the inner cities. So the integration office was created in 1998, and this piece kind of tells us and really focusing on housing situation, where rather than the inner cities, but what tends to happen in Europe, sometimes it's the inner cities, but sometimes it's also suburbs that get filled with tenement housing, right? The subsidized housing. We might call the projects in the United States. They are not way they're not way downtown, but they are actually in the suburbs. And this is where a lot of migrants would go to because again they are below income. They would be like low income seeking housing. And again,